Good morning, everybody. Great to be with you. My name is Michael Millerman, millermanschool.com, and today we're going to be going over some articles on Nietzsche and the crisis of masculinity, John Rawls and Marxism, and some other things that I have lined up. So enjoy the show. All right, this first article is from thepointmag.com, and let me show you who it's by somewhere here. Oh, I guess we'll get to it. Hang on a second. This article is by, here you go, you see that? Matt Messerschmidt. It's called Overman on Nietzsche and Our Crisis of Masculinity, published August 16th, 2024. And if you ever just want to look at something where there are articles every day that sometimes might interest you or might not, if you go to aldaily.com, that's Arts and Letters Daily, aldaily.com, this was one of their feature articles today. It's something that I had planned to discuss with you yesterday on the live stream, but we ran out of time, so let's do it now. Okay, here we go. Like many others, I first read Nietzsche as a teenage boy. In the fall of 2001, at the age of 15, I learned that I was to have brain surgery and I needed reading material for the recovery period. In preparation for a month or so spent largely in bed, I browsed the Barnes & Noble philosophy shelves and selected Plato's Symposium. Great choice. In fact, I have my laptop propped up right now on Leo Strauss's commentary on the Symposium. Plato, Strauss's Symposium and Republic, and Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Okay, well, those are great books to start your study of philosophy with. And in fact, this is me now commenting, not the article. These are books you can read again and again for the rest of your life. The Republic, for sure. The Symposium, for sure. Nietzsche, for sure. So if you haven't read these books, you should, okay? So this person was preparing to spend a month in bed, picked up Plato and Nietzsche. These texts were my first foray into philosophy, the author writes. Post-surgery, when I could do little but read, Plato and Nietzsche competed for my affection. Nietzsche won. Oh, part of me just died inside. Okay, I wonder if you're watching this and you have also read Plato and read Nietzsche and had a confrontation of Plato with Nietzsche. You know, once again, that's a lifelong kind of project. You don't really have to come down on one side or the other. But I wonder what you think. For me, Plato won. But anyway, for this author, Nietzsche won. Plenty of authors had been presented to me, he writes, as radical or revolutionary voices, but only with Nietzsche did the act of reading itself feel thrillingly subversive. I knew in a general way, of course, that other thinkers of the 19th century whom I had read, such as Marx and Dickinson and Thoreau, had in some sense rejected what we call quote-unquote society. But Nietzsche felt like a profound revolt in a way that they had not. It seemed to me that he succeeded in a far deeper way than those other writers at saying what was not supposed to be said and saying it in a way in which it was not supposed to be said. Okay, I'm going to make a quick comment here. For those of you who do know Leo Strauss and who are aware of a little bit of Plato, a little bit of Nietzsche, and you want to think this issue through about, well, Nietzsche's the more explosive writer in a sense, but Plato is also, in his own way, thrillingly subversive. And there's an author named Lawrence Lampert, has a good book on Leo Strauss and Nietzsche that you might take a look at on this particular topic, why Strauss was attracted to Plato and not Nietzsche, and why, according to this author, Strauss could have been more effective if he had adopted Nietzsche's more openly, thrillingly subversive style. But okay, let's get back to the article. The voice of Nietzsche was unmistakably the voice of a man who was asserting himself as a man. Maybe I was especially susceptible to the allure of such a voice at that specific moment in time, as I endured the deeply emasculating experience of undergoing a surgery that would leave me bedridden for a month, enfeebling my body, causing pretty dramatic weight loss, and ruling out further participation in high school sports, which had been central to my identity and the basis of many of my male friendships. In that state, the author writes, Nietzsche's valorizations of pain were particularly appealing. The days-long headaches were given meaning by statements like, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger," a declaration that had not yet been appropriated by Kelly Clarkson. This idea of manly strength in suffering was embodied by a cast of male characters ranging from Greek tragic heroes to Roman Stoics and Germanic warriors. Nietzsche celebrated strength, assertiveness, stoicism, self-affirmation, and above all, power, an inward-looking power over the self, and an ecstatic, outwardly questing power that projected itself onto the world. He fused together these virtues, unmistakably cast as masculine, in the invigorating term self-overcoming. Sorry, one second. I had grown up, I was repeatedly told, in a culture dominated by men, by male voices, by male interests, by male points of view. Raised in a progressive family in the college town of East Lansing, Michigan, this author writes, I accepted this description of the world. Yet, paradoxically, it was precisely the assertive maleness of the voice I encountered in the Nietzsche text that felt so profoundly radical. I just want to pause for a minute and ask those of you who are watching, just on this point, because I am curious about it. Are there authors, especially the men who are watching? I mean, if you're a woman, you may want to comment from your own perspective, I guess, but did you experience this idea that there's an attack on masculinity around you, and then you read something that makes you feel assertive, like this? He says it was precisely the assertive maleness of the voice that felt so profoundly radical. I know for some people, Bronze Age Pervert, the author of Bronze Age Mindset, has accomplished that. And I just wonder for others of you, was it Nietzsche if you had that? Was it somebody else? Or, does this issue is not relatable to you, resonating with the text because it has a positive assertion of masculinity? I have a course in my school. I'm not pitching it. I'm just telling you, philosophical analysis of masculinity, because I find it's quite interesting how from Plato to Aristotle to the modern thinkers, Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau, to Machiavelli, not to mention Nietzsche and even Heidegger, somebody I'm interested in, Alexander Dugin, someone I'm interested in, the notion of masculinity shifts in different ways from one thinker to another thinker. So for some people, masculinity means strength, willpower, you have to wrestle, you have to be a provider, you have to be just a strong physical presence. And, for people who are intrigued by, interested in, or in love in their own way with Plato and with Socrates, did not have, in some sense, those traditionally quote unquote masculine characteristics, although he was courageous in his own way. So it's a huge question, actually. Masculinity and these various philosophers. So I'm just curious, if that's an issue that any of you have experienced directly in the way that this author did when he read Nietzsche and felt, inspired by the positive assertion of masculinity in a profoundly radical way. So back to the article. At home, my father would never have talked about being a man, and my mother seemed, one other thing. I know for some people, or actually I assume for some people, I kind of encountered this when I was younger myself. There's a community of pickup artists. Now, this was a long time ago, so I think that some of them actually did transition into the quote unquote manosphere, and they all have different lives now than they had then. But there was one of them, I don't remember his name. He had a lecture series called On Being a Man. So he was kind of like a pickup artist, but also self-help guru who is teaching men to be comfortable in their masculinity or manliness. And then now sometimes you see on Twitter like these masculinity workshops where they're floating and crying or whatever. So it's a big topic here, I guess. Okay, at home, my father would never have talked about being a man, and my mother seemed only ever to tell me about how men were in order to tell me how I should not be. Men didn't listen to women. Men were stubborn and vain. Men didn't know how to load a dishwasher. At school, there were plenty of class discussions like the one led by our German teacher on how much better the world would be if women held all political power. But this sort of talk wasn't simply transmitted by our elders. At our staff meetings for the high school newspaper's opinion page, the hottest discussion topic was sex and gender, and an especially well-worn theme was generalized male entitlement and selfishness in sex, a stressful conversation topic as a virgin already obsessed with worries about basic performance. Of course, the author continues, it isn't as if any one of these reflections on men was emotionally devastating on its own, but they were coming from all sides. The world demanded masculine men, but smart people could not say that men needed to be masculine. Smart books certainly could not say that, or so it appeared to me until I found Nietzsche. Okay, again, I think for most young men today, or many young men today, contemporary Nietzscheans fill this function, like Bronze Age Pervert probably most obviously, but the manosphere too, I would think. So if you have any experience in that you're comfortable sharing, when did you start to recognize, if you ever did, that men needed to be masculine, when the people around you were denying that, and when smart books weren't saying it? Was there an author who, red-pilled you? What was so powerful about Nietzsche was not that he was presenting some new, as yet unheard of way of being a man. On the contrary, the masculine ethos articulated by Nietzsche felt as if it was what the world already demanded of boys. To do any of the things that really mattered to a 15-year-old boy, one needed the assertiveness and purposiveness he counseled, and one would have needed them whether or not one ever got around to reading Nietzsche. These traits seemed necessary to attract girls, to excel at sports, to earn the respect of other boys. But the gap between the world as seen by Nietzsche and the world as seen by a progressive college town was that Nietzsche openly extolled the masculine characteristics demanded by the real social world, whereas the real social world condemned those characteristics while it demanded them. Despite all the very real social penalties for failing to live up to standards of masculinity, in any and every conversation I ever had, this author writes in East Lansing, about gender, those very standards were explicitly and roundly condemned as poisonous. In such discussions, the words male, man, and masculinity were far more often invoked pejoratively than neutrally or positively. Toxic masculinity was not yet a catchphrase in the early aughts, but masculinity was already toxic in our town. His challenge, meaning Nietzsche's challenge, to this enforced cultural contradiction was something both new and liberating. Yeah, just as I read this, I went to high school in Michigan. Even though I grew up in Canada, I finished high school in Michigan. I'm just thinking, boy, I don't remember. I mean, I know now race and gender is everywhere, and probably even at the time when I was going to school, it was, but I was just on my own wavelength in such a big way at the time that I didn't notice any of it. But I guess people who were like baked into the mainstream at the time, who hadn't yet broken from it, they were probably saturated with this growing hostility towards a white man and so on. All right, here we go, back to the article. I'm not sure I knew any boy in East Lansing who was not raised in a similarly progressive household, or who did not grow up to be at least left of center enough to vote for the Democratic Party. But even among that political demographic, there was in hindsight a clear thirst for masculinist literature more broadly. I shared and circulated my Nietzsche books, and from other teenage male readers, I found my way to Hemingway, Mishima, and Cormac McCarthy. We all knew, he writes, that patriarchy was real, that women made some 80 cents for every dollar made by men, that rape culture at the local Michigan State University was a very serious problem, that our mothers spent more time cleaning up the house than our fathers did. Still, there was a near universal appeal among boy readers to male writers who did what our progressive hometown could not do, assign meaning to the experience of being a man, and offer up a positive vision, however flawed, of masculinity. Prior to my encounters with such authors, I had not so much believed as simply assumed that masculinity could only ever be a problem, never a positive possibility, that bringing out the best in me would mean overcoming my manhood, not finding the right way to live my manhood. That was just the way everyone around me talked. Yeah, that's so surprising because, again, it's commonplace now, but then again, increasingly so is the pushback against it. Was this a topic in and around you growing up? Being a man, man up. What is it to be a man? What's the right way? What should you suppress and what should you intensify? Okay, let's go here. Next section of this article. So those of you who are just tuning in, I'm Michael Millerman. We're reading this article called Overman on Nietzsche and Our Crisis of Masculinity by Matt Messerschmidt in, I think it's called thepointmag.com. Okay, so that's what we're looking at together. If you go to millermanschool.com, where I teach online, you'll see I have a course on Plato's Republic, on Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and a course on masculinity. For what it's worth, the way that masculinity has been interpreted over the course of the history of political philosophy. Okay, so let's go back. We're here. 22 years after my first encounter with Nietzsche, I am a Nietzsche scholar, this author writes. It was sometime after I had written what could be termed a feminist interpretation of Nietzsche for an edited volume on Nietzsche and women that I reflected for the first time in a long time upon my initial encounter with the philosopher and on what his thought had meant to me as a young man. I found myself deeply conflicted in ways that catalyzed a broader reflection on both gender and academia. The mainline academic response to Nietzsche and gender over the last half century, influenced by thinkers in and adjacent to post-structuralist continental philosophy, such as Jacques Derrida, Sarah Kaufman, and Judith Butler, finds in Nietzsche a largely unwitting ally to the cause of feminism. Despite being an over-the-top misogynist, Nietzsche teaches us that there is no innate human essence, let alone a timeless essence of man or woman. I'll just pause for a minute. I call this left Nietzscheanism. So when the postmodern left incorporated Nietzsche, they used him as an attack on all natures, essences, substances, and fixed identities. So he became a useful hammer in their hands to hammer away at the patriarchy and so on. Okay, but there's also a right Nietzscheanism, which I've written about and talked about before, represented, as I say, most conspicuously by BAP. A genealogy, in Nietzsche's word, adopted then by Butler, of the human desires that structure our society today reveals that these desires are historically indexed and malleable, and that the social identities, such as gender identities that are founded on them, are therefore changeable. A human being becomes who they are in the performance of an identity that is realized in the very performance, rather than by expressing a true self deep down inside that precedes and determines the performance. This foreshadows Butler's notion of gender performativity, which applies this logic to gender identity. I, the author writes, don't want to deny the validity of this way of reading Nietzsche, and in fact find it both correct and important. But when one interprets Nietzsche this way, the question becomes what to make of the Nietzsche that greets his teenage boy readers. That Nietzsche is also a real Nietzsche. Nietzsche routinely fetishizes the martial values of the Greeks. He appears to celebrate the masculine virtues prized by the Romans over those virtues emphasized by Christianity, which are unambiguously cast as effeminate. In art, tragedy loved by Nietzsche is harsh and manly, whereas romantic poetry and opera, despised selectively by Nietzsche, is indulgent and feminine. Nietzsche's Übermensch, the overman, though perhaps most accurately translated as overhuman, is clearly a male figure, an avatar of unprecedented creative production achieved via great destruction. I just want to make a quick comment on this. So you have this person who, as a teen boy, read Nietzsche and had his world blown apart, was able to connect to his masculine impulses and see a positive figure of masculinity for the first time. Later becomes a professor of Nietzsche, writes on feminist interpretations, and then, the old self meets the young self and says, wait a minute, there must be more to the picture than this, because he affected me one way when I was a teenage boy. Why am I writing about the feminist Nietzsche now? Something must have gone wrong from point A to point B. And now he has to recognize the powerful masculine impulses in Nietzsche's writing. So what's funny to me, there's a scholar, and I won't get into all of the details, won't get into all of the drama and all of the gossip. I'll just state this as much as I can at the level of facts. There's a scholar of political philosophy named Ronald Biener. And Ronald Biener, in and around 2016, apparently became concerned with the political potentials of Nietzsche's writing. So this author is talking about, masculinity in Nietzsche. And Biener became aware that, look, people are teaching Nietzsche to undergraduate students, and they're not recognizing that that's like, this is a Trojan horse, this is a time bomb. Like, if people actually take Nietzsche seriously, you're going to radicalize them politically. And I think he talks about Richard Spencer having been red-pilled by Nietzsche. Again, this is around 2016 when there's some fear about the alt-right and Trump's neo-fascist Nazism and worse than Hitler and all of this sort of thing. And it's pretty interesting to see. I think there's a book called that Biener wrote in and around that time called Dangerous Minds, The Rise of the Far Right, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and the Return of the Far Right, something like that. So why do I mention it? It's this phenomenon of, hey, we're teaching Nietzsche, sometimes in postmodernist courses, like connected to Judith Butler and performative gender and leftist topics, but hey, it's actually radicalizing young men on the right. We better hit the brakes on this. Better send out an email to the department. Hush, hush about Nietzsche. Please, there's this new breed of right-wing Nietzscheans coming up and radicalizing our young males. And they're becoming part of this new far-right phenomenon. So I just thought I'd tell you that, okay? That's something that people who teach Nietzsche started to get worried about. All the more so those who teach Heidegger, because there are Heideggerians on the right too. All right, here we go back to the article. Hope you didn't mind that little digression. For half a century, academic engagements with Nietzsche have often treated these gendered accents that run through his corpus as entirely undercut by the latent feminist possibilities I described above. As a matter of interpretive correctness, this can come across as a kind of wishful thinking. While Nietzsche's misogyny is hardly ever flatly denied by his critics, the valorization of manliness and denigration of women is generally assumed to be utterly defanged by scholarly analysis. Moreover, this way of reading also risks sterilizing Nietzsche's writing. In my experience, explaining to undergraduates that Nietzsche is loved for his feminist possibilities is less likely to receive an immediate response of either indignation or invigorated sympathy for Nietzsche than it is to be met with glazed eyes. The text becomes much more boring when the case is made that the clear masculinist or misogynist message of the text we have been reading is not the real gender deconstructing or feminist message. That intelligent, educated 20-year-olds need someone with a PhD to tell them the real message, which is the message they would never have arrived at their own. This renders Nietzsche not just arcane, but boring. By the way, I would say here, something similar happens in a way with Plato. This is the more interesting thing, because Nietzsche, everybody knows that Nietzsche's dynamite, right? But not everybody knows that Plato's dynamite. So when you discover that he doesn't just have a theory of ideas, and we're going to read Plato to see his place in the history of epistemology. When you read Nietzsche and you discover when you read Plato and you discover how Plato is dynamite, which you have to do through the help of people like Leo Strauss, that becomes an amazing thing, okay? Which I strongly recommend that you do. But yeah, so you can't go to a class of undergraduate students and tell them that Nietzsche is a feminist, because that is just not just arcane, but boring. This whitewashing approach to Nietzsche can obscure Nietzsche's present cultural meaning in the world beyond academia. And its influence detached me for a long time, the author says, from any consideration of the overwhelmingly male Nietzsche who had appealed to me as a boy. I was jolted back into reflection upon that Nietzsche last year when, in office hours, a male student sheepishly brought up Jordan Peterson in connection to the Will to Power notes we had read in class, relating the austere self-control that Nietzsche calls the mark of strong life to Peterson's injunction to young men to clean your room. For many boys and men, Nietzsche is still a specifically male voice addressing young male readers. Just why is it that so many Nietzsche readers are very young men? What is Nietzsche offering them? Okay, I gotta say something about this too. When I was at the University of Toronto as a teaching assistant, it was so funny to me because I had students come to me sometimes who knew kind of my work and my interests, and they would confide in me or they would talk to me semi-privately, let's say after class, because they had liberal feminist professors and leftists, and communist Marxists, whatever, right? Boring, sanitized, anodyne professors, and they needed an outlet to say something. And so I remember one of them telling me, he's like, he had expressed an interest in Jordan Peterson in one of his classes, and it was like immediate blowback that he's like the reincarnation of Hitler. Both Peterson and the student, it's like, they had swastikas tattooed on their forehead or something like that, which is so funny. People wanted to be discussed. I mean, students, think about it. The university atmosphere was depriving young male students of the possibility of discussing even Jordan Peterson. I say even Jordan Peterson because I don't regard him as a radical. Okay, so all the more so, it would have been off the table to discuss the people who raise the questions like in a dynamite sort of way, with all of the power, potential, and danger of dynamite. Okay, so why are so many Nietzsche readers very young men? What is Nietzsche offering them? And let me just ask you guys again, do you have this experience directly? Were you attracted to Nietzsche? I mean, if the world has been emasculated, if we are long-housed, if things have become effeminate, if we live, like Dugan says, in the era of Cybele, the great mother, with the cult of male castration, then it could be reinvigorating to read somebody who asserts will, power, vitality, expansion, conquest. dominion. When my college course syllabus, this author continues, turns to Nietzsche, someone invariably volunteers that he had read some Nietzsche in high school, and that someone is invariably a man. In other words, it's the men who are reading Nietzsche in high school. Men are visibly more passionate about Nietzsche than about other writers I teach. Even when students love Nietzsche, though, the most controversial questions that I raise in reference to his thought render them shy. Yeah, I bet. Okay, if you are a student or you have been a student, you're sitting in a classroom and you know what the zeitgeist is about these topics. If you say the wrong thing, who knows, right? You'll be a mark of Cain for the rest of your life. And then the professor asks you, so, what do you think about Nietzsche's political views and his views on men and women? Come on, that's like a honeypot, that's like a setting you up. That's a trap. That's a trap. Shouldn't be a trap. You should be able to discuss it. It should be a topic that's up for discussion. But the sad reality of many university campuses today is that everybody knows you can't speak freely about the controversial topics that everybody cares about. I've told the story before. I have written about it in an article called Why Students Are Terrified to Speak, which you can look up if you want to. When I was a teaching assistant at the University of Toronto once upon a time, I walked my students through a little exercise, okay? I can't remember who had done the original video. Maybe it was Steve Crowder, maybe it was somebody else, but I told them about this video I saw where a man's on campus and he goes around telling people, he's like, let's say a 30-year-old white man, okay? 6 feet tall. And he's going around and he's telling students that he identifies as a woman. And they're like, okay, cool, man, whatever, whatever floats your boat, that's awesome. Good for you. They're all happy about it, so to speak. Then he starts saying, he identifies as an Asian. They're like, okay, that's kind of weird, but all right, whatever, you do you. And so on. He starts saying he identifies as a 5-year-old. Nobody can really push back on him. He identifies as a short person. Nobody really pushes back on him. And at the end of the video, he says, at a university campus today, there should be somebody who is able to tell me that I'm not, a 4 foot tall black Asian woman. This 6 foot, 30-year-old white guy. So he's like, university students have been so programmed that they can't call a spade a spade. They have to agree to every absurdity. So I told this to my class. I was setting up a discussion because I'm a teaching assistant, right? So I was setting up a discussion about, well, how far does this go? The free identification. If you can freely identify gender, why not age, height, all these other sorts of things? So I asked the question. Nobody said anything. Pretty good question, in my opinion. I had set up a pretty good discussion, I thought. This was just about the end of our time together in the seminar. So I said, look, guys, okay, fine. Nobody is saying anything. I have another session right after this one. I tried to make this an interesting conversation. I said to them, I tried to set it up with this good kind of example, something for us to discuss. And what can I do differently? Like, what feedback, I asked my students, can you give me so that I can set up this thought experiment for my next seminar more effectively? And one woman raised her hand and she said to me, she said, the example is great. It's an amazing story. And, I have something that I want to say about it, but I didn't put up my hand because I was worried that I would be judged by the other students in class, especially because it's kind of a controversial topic about identity. And then this was the wildest moment in my whole time as a teaching assistant at the University of Toronto. I asked the class, who else had something that they would like to say in response to, this example of the guy who identifies as a Chinese little girl or whatever. I said, who else has something that they want to say, but is afraid to put up their hand? And if you've ever been a teacher or you've ever been in a classroom, you're going to understand what I'm about to tell you, which is that something happened that every teacher dreams of, but that never happens, which is that every single person in the classroom put up their hand. I'm not kidding. To repeat, I said, who has something they want to say, but is afraid to discuss it because you have fear that you're going to be judged by your classmates? Everybody. This was University of Toronto Department of Political Science. This is where Canada's future politicians potentially are being trained. It's Canada's top university, Department of Political Science. Nobody spoke up because everybody was afraid that they would be judged for sharing an opinion that could get them in trouble. You just think about that. That is a stifling and suffocating atmosphere. That's fear. In the Soviet Union, you don't speak because you're afraid. Yeah, my family's from the former Soviet Union. But this is, as I said, this was 2000, probably 2017 or so. So you think about that. Now this author is saying, even when students love Nietzsche, though, the most controversial questions I raise in reference to his thought render them shy. Yeah, it's not shy. It's fear. Students have been taught that they should keep their mouths shut if they have anything interesting, genuine, or true to say. Okay, back to the article. Is human behavior really governed by the will to power? Could violence really be as health-inducing as Nietzsche suggests? Can we accept anything that Nietzsche says about men and women? These blunt questions sometimes slow down class discussion, generating diplomatic tiptoeing answers, and are usually avoided entirely on papers. Yeah, because these students know, right? They will be marked. I have never taught a class with Nietzsche on the syllabus without at least one male student coming to office hours to reveal a passion for Nietzsche that either preceded our class or led him beyond the assigned reading. But even these excited discussions, which I, he writes, am grateful for and enjoy, rarely result in a crystal clear claim about how some controversial Nietzschean idea causes us to rethink the world. Yeah, by the way, these students have good reason to be cautious with their professors, okay? Because a lot of these professors are basically Stasi. Maybe, though, my demand that students take a firm stance on these sorts of questions is unfair. Maybe their silence is not entirely due to fear of controversy, but rather or also due to the difficulty of answering such questions confidently. My margin notes on the Nietzsche books I read in high school transitioned back and forth from worship to visceral attack several times in the space of 2 pages. When I ask my students to yield confident answers to such questions, then I am in effect asking them to take a stronger stance on Nietzsche than I was able ever to do as a young reader. When I was a teenager, he continues, there was an enticing, fantasy-inducing path to masculine meaning implied in the Nietzsche that my friends and I were reading. But that path felt so captivatingly edgy, precisely because we were products of our progressive upbringing, and we knew that we were. We did not secretly hope for a return to traditional gender norms. My friends in East Lansing who were reading Beyond Good and Evil and For Whom the Bell Tolls responded positively to idealized portraits of masculinity, but they also supported gay marriage, used the word bro disparagingly, and called themselves feminists. Nietzsche, like those East Lansing boys, neither believed in nor wished for the possibility of a return to the past. The starting point of his thought is that God is dead, and old paths to meaning have irretrievably fled from the world as it exists today. We have unchained the earth from its sun, he has a madman say in The Gay Science, that announces the death of God, and are plunging perpetually backwards, sideways, forwards, toward all sides. In Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche whispers to the conservatives that under these modern conditions, a backtracking is in no shape or form possible. To be sure, Nietzsche poetizes a version of masculinity that borrows from the past, but he does not yearn for a return to traditional conservative gender roles, because for him the wish to return to traditional forms of meaning-making is generally delusional in modernity. For any man who wants to find meaning in such traditional roles, then Nietzsche is not the sympathetic voice that he might at first appear. Nietzsche believed in proto-existentialist fashion that the void of meaning that is modernity must urgently be filled, and that this task must be an individual endeavor, at least for the person who is strong enough for it. All of the masculine self-assertion, the will to power that he celebrates, is not in the service of some old patriarchal form of life, but is rather to be harnessed and focused toward new, as yet unseen forms of life, toward new paths to meaning. In other words, Nietzsche's anguished masculine energy builds on the abyss, to invoke one of his favorite terms. This, it seems to me, is a view of the world that resonates strongly with the worldview of boys who grow up believing that an old version of masculinity has indeed grown toxic, that old masculine ideals have expired without being replaced by new ones. I think we're close to the end of the article. Let's keep going. It's pretty good so far. Hope you're enjoying it. Again, we're reading from The Point mag. I'll review the name of the author shortly as we get through this. Manhood has become an abyss in a place like East Lansing. The notion that changing gender dynamics are liberating for you personally and offer you new possibilities of meaning has, for good reasons, been pitched far more fervently to young women growing up in progressive environs than to young men. Society has told young women, for instance, that you can find meaning in your job instead of your family. If you want to do that, the opposite message, that you can be a whole and happy person by raising a family, has been pitched far more weakly and infrequently to young men. Young men see that an old vision of masculinity has grown problematic, but no new vision has taken its place. There is only a void of meaning. Nietzsche's word for such a void is nihilism, and I don't think it's a stretch to say that modern masculinity has become nihilistic. Who is better equipped to serve as an interlocutor for the young man whose very gender identity is experienced as a state of being unmoored and rootless than the philosopher who says that our entire world has come unchained from any center of gravity or source of warmth? Now I pause for the article for a minute. I recently watched a documentary on John McAfee. I think it's called Running with the Devil. And if I'm not mistaken, I remember the filmmaker there saying that McAfee is living a nihilistic life, which I think is kind of interesting because in his own way, McAfee is a certain sort of symbol of a male rebellion, right? Outlaw, pirate, out on the high seas, his ship stocked with guns, running from the law, from Bahamas, Guatemala, Belize, right? John McAfee is in his own way a model of a man who's trying to carve out a new way of being a man in the world, I would say. And so just this statement that masculinity is nihilistic reminded me of the passage in that documentary on McAfee called Running with the Devil, where McAfee is described as a nihilist. Okay, back to the article. Perhaps this is why boys continue to be drawn to Nietzsche. Of course, their reasons for reading Nietzsche should not necessarily be our reasons for prescribing Nietzsche to them. To tell young people to drive aggressively toward their own chosen meaning in life, in a world which has lost the ability to provide meaning for them, is a message that carries great risks. What if they drive so aggressively that their aggression forecloses other possible directions or turns to violence? Why shouldn't it turn to violence if they're living in a modern world that has no meaning? Who would feel the responsibility to care for such a world? And what if their own chosen meaning turns out to be dark, even despicable? During my 9 years at the University of Chicago, I heard more than once from faculty or graduate students that Leopold and Loeb, the Chicago Law School students who in the 1920s sought to commit the perfect murder and become Nietzschean overmen, had a stupid, caricatured sense of Nietzsche's message. Over drinks at Nietzsche conferences, I heard similar complaints about the association of Nietzsche with Fight Club, the 1999 film about men escaping a cubicled modern American dystopia by finding distinctly male meaning in the act of mercilessly knocking the shit out of each other. That's what it says in the article. Sorry for the swear. By the way, I heard they're remaking this with women protagonists. Take that for what it's worth. These may be caricatures of Nietzschean thought, but they're not completely unrelated to what Nietzsche says and thinks. To pretend they are runs a risk similar to that of the feminist take on Nietzsche I described above. It can disconnect an ivory tower view of the philosopher from his actual social meaning outside the university. Nevertheless, I hope my male students keep finding their way to Nietzsche. Many of them are searching for alternatives to the message that they are toxic. And some of the spokesmen for masculinity they have found offer solutions that are worse than the problem to which they are reacting. That'd be nice to have a little side note on that, see exactly who he has in mind. What solutions does Nietzsche offer? And maybe he's thinking like Tate, for example. What solutions does Nietzsche offer? As with so many other topics in his body of work, to distill his quote-unquote vision of masculinity into any static, systematic, and coherent dogma would be to falsify his thought. Yet that very fact may make Nietzsche the perfect thinker on manhood for a time like ours, when good men can find themselves pulled in multiple contradictory directions. Just looking at funny comments in the chat. When good men can find themselves pulled in multiple contradictory directions, ethically compelled to listen to the demands of feminism, but in search of a male identity that modern gender paradigms do not seem ready to supply. The path out of outdated ways of living masculinity cannot be simply to keep telling men that their maleness is bad, and Nietzsche's call to self-affirmation may have something to offer them as a corrective to that message. In his best moments, Nietzsche's ideal of manly purposiveness is expressed as confident, focused, goal-directed action that is conducive to the building of a better world. Quote, the active, aggressive, ambitious man is still 100 paces closer to justice than the reactive one, unquote. He tells us in Beyond Good and Evil. This purposiveness has an individualistic strain that could speak to the lonely, atomized modern male, but without inviting him to wallow in a tragic heroism of loneliness like Elliot Rodger, the 2014 Isla Vista killer and self-identified incel did. Nietzsche has Zarathustra tell his listeners that he is going my way because the way does not exist. And yet Zarathustra takes the time over and over again, over hundreds of pages, to speak to men searching for meaning. That's true. If you go to NietzscheCourse.com, it'll take you to my Zarathustra course. Nietzsche consistently champions focus, the formula for my happiness: a yes, a no, a straight line, a goal. Yet the indefinite article, a goal, leaves open the question of what this striving should be for, or what values should inform it. Indeed, a critical element of this vision of striving seems to be that the man himself supplies the goal. This picture of focused, independently minded striving has the potential to be a healthy model for men, and that Nietzsche views it as a masculine picture cannot on one level be doubted. Yet at the same time, the contours of that masculinity are not static. The vision is delivered by the philosopher who calls himself the disciple of Dionysus, a quasi-non-binary god who's represented in Nietzsche's Early Birth of Tragedy as the female element in a heterosexual union with Apollo, supplying tonic earthly energy to Apollo's form-giving potency. Okay, pause for a minute. I got to say something really quickly about that. You can go read Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, obviously, but those of you who are interested in Alexander Dugin, you should know he has a model in his Noomachia book series of 3 logoi: Apollo, Dionysus. So you have that from Nietzsche, Apollo and Dionysus. But another one, Cybele, the light logos, the dark logos, and the black logos. Okay, light is Apollo, dark is Dionysus, and black is Cybele. And each of them, Apollo, Dionysus, Cybele, light logos, dark logos, black logos, has a version of the androgynous figure. And so there's like an Apollonian masculinity, an Apollonian femininity, a Dionysian masculinity, Dionysian femininity, and same with Cybele. Okay, Cybelian masculinity, Cybelian femininity. So kind of nice expansion on this idea here. Nietzsche, the proponent of masculinity, calls himself a disciple of Dionysus, a non-binary god represented as the female element in a heterosexual union with Apollo. Okay, so if that kind of thinking is interesting to you, you should definitely look at Dugin's Noomachia. Yes, I do teach it at my school. There are other ways you can look into it too. There are moments when Nietzsche seems to identify himself or his philosophical project with Ariadne, the female human lover of Dionysus. And for the creative focused striving he valorizes, Nietzsche doesn't just draw on Apollonian manhood, he also uses the metaphor of motherhood. In short, Nietzsche seems to say as stridently as possible, be a man, but to ask in the same breath, but what is a man? Reactionary followers seem to want to hear only the imperative, and feminist scholars hear only the question. Okay, that's nice formulation. So Nietzsche gives you both the imperative and the question. Yeah, I quite like that formulation. I think that is extremely valuable to think through. Perhaps now it sounds as if the writings of Nietzsche place men in a bind similar to the one I, this author, experienced as a teenage boy. The need to quote unquote be a man, and simultaneously the need to question manhood itself. The critical difference, I think, is that Nietzsche removes the guilt from this state of internal division, proceeding as if one can assertively do both at the same time. It took me a long time to consider this as a possibility in Nietzsche's thinking or in general. Masculinity cannot be an untroubled concept today. If it were untroubled, that would indicate that feminism had failed entirely. But men remain and need ways to understand themselves positively as men. As a teenager, I only heard Nietzsche saying, be a man. And as a young scholar, I abandoned my earlier way of reading him, hearing only but what is a man. Now, as a teacher to male students who are strongly impacted by the first message, I've learned to hear both together. Oh, that was nice. Okay, I liked that. That was a good article. So let me tell you what we've been reading. So you can find it, support the publication, look up the author, okay? You can feel free to respond to this article, not just by commenting on my video, but going over to thepointmag.com. This was published at thepointmag.com, Overman on Nietzsche and Our Crisis of Masculinity, August 16th. The author's name you see there, Matt Messerschmidt. So that was quite good. Wouldn't you say so? Feel free to comment on that here too. I enjoyed that. So I have another article pulled up for you. A couple other things to discuss. Let's see. What should we do? We've got John Rawls and the death of Western Marxism. We've got the far-right campaign to explode the population. Somebody yesterday reminded me that this would be an interesting topic for us to cover. And reflections on mirrors for princes. Modern Age puts out some good things. What do we most feel like covering here? I think it's going to be this one, the far-right's campaign to explode the population. But if there's something you'd rather do, let me know. And I do want to show you something quickly. So give me 1 second. I'll just stop the screen share, pull this up for you, and then put the screen back on. Yeah, that was a good article. I'd love to know if you have a response to it. Again, many things you could say about it, but overall, I thought it was very good. Good for us to discuss, good for us to read. And okay, so let me just, again, briefly, I told you that I have this manliness. In fact, I was commissioned to do a course on manliness by a group that at the time was gathering men to discuss what it is to be a man. And they said, look, how has manliness been discussed over the history of philosophy? Do like basically a philosophical course on manliness. So I did that. Who's a real man? What makes a man good? Is man will to power? That's the Nietzschean aspect, you see. Should a man be only a man of action or also a man who can give an account of himself? Is manliness something to be overcome or something to restore? Pre-modern, modern, postmodern perspective. So I told you, here's the Nietzsche. Postmodern left, that's how Nietzsche has been read by the postmodernists. Postmodern right, that's a little bit of Bronze Age pervert, a little bit of Heidegger and the right Heideggerians. So I just tell you, it's a good topic, okay? Then, again, those of you who are interested, if you're not, no big deal. My course on Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and I just mentioned to you, again, at least be aware of the name, okay? Oops, sorry for the pop-up. At least be aware of the name here. When I told you Dugin has this model of Apollo, Dionysus, and Cybele, this word that you see on screen, if you're looking, noomachia, Noomakhia, that's his book series that uses that model to do an analysis of civilizations. Because he's like, what has happened? Western civilization. What's going on with Western civilization today? In a nutshell, it's the victory of the logos of Cybele over the logos of Apollo and Dionysus. And what does it mean to restore the West today? It means to restore the logos of Apollo and Dionysus and to put Cybele back in her place, so to speak. So there's more to it than that, but since I mentioned it in my reading, I thought I'd show you it on screen. Okay, well, I always pull up a lot of articles. We can't always get to them. I haven't read this one. Usually, if you're new here, I'll just tell you. Usually I pull up articles that interest me, but I don't read them in advance. We read them together and then I just comment on them as we go through, which I enjoy doing and you seem to enjoy. So I think we're going to do it too with this article at Politico, the far right's campaign to explode the population. That means to make it bigger, okay, not to annihilate it. Behind the scenes at the first NATO conference, where a motley alliance is throwing out the idea of winning converts to their cause and trying to make their own instead. By the way, I have to acknowledge, because I saw a super chat earlier, which I am very grateful for. So let me just thank you for that, Mo. Much appreciated. Mo writes, as a 16-year-old, I experienced Nietzsche for the first time. Other than reading the words, I could not understand anything, but I felt an immense change within me. Strauss affirmed my impressions of Nietzsche years later. Very interesting. Mo, thank you for that comment and for the super chat. And I'm not going over all the comments, but I see people are commenting about where they heard about Nietzsche, what they find valuable in his thinking, and all of that. So that's good. I appreciate that, guys. Have the conversation going in the chat. Yes, Fight Club with women, cat fight club. That made me laugh. Dionysus has pure bro energy. Well, it's interesting because, again, you might say Dionysus does have something effeminate, does have something feminine, does have something liminal, transgressive. Dionysus is not just the man of light. Dionysus also goes into the darkness. So he's kind of more of a mystical figure in a sense than Apollo. Apollo's mysticism is purely vertical. Apollo goes to the top of the mountain in the brightest of the bright light. It's kind of like the ascent out of the cave. What happens, in the cave, the sun in Plato's cave allegory is described as beyond being. So you go up the chain of being. The Apollonian goes up, up, up into the light, into the light, into the light, and then goes even beyond being. But it's like a vertical ascent, whereas Dionysus is somehow a journey into the underworld as well, more cyclical and more mysterious. Okay, all right. Let's go back to the article. Whoops. Sorry guys, you see my production value here is not necessarily the world's greatest, but the far right's campaign to explode the population. All right, let's do this. I think this will probably be the last one. When was this published? Hold on, yeah, I gotta know when it was published, right? January, February, March, April 28th. So this was earlier this year. So things have changed obviously since April, but let's look at it anyways. The threat, we are told here this weekend, is existential, biological, epoch defining. Economies will fail, civilizations will fall, and it will all happen because people aren't having enough babies. The entire global financial system, the value of your money, and every asset you might buy with money is defined by leverage, which means its value depends on growth. Kevin Dolan, a 37-year-old father of 6 from Virginia, tells the crowd that has gathered to hear him speak. Every country in the developed world and most countries in the developing world face long-term population decline at a level that makes growth impossible to maintain, Dolan says, which means we are sitting on the bubble of all bubbles. Despite this grim prognosis, the mood is optimistic. It's early December, a few weeks before Christmas, and the 100-odd people who have flocked to Austin for the first Natal conference are here to come up with solutions. Though relatively small as conferences go, NatalCon has attracted attendees who are almost intensely dedicated to the cause of raising the US birth rate. The broader natalist movement has been gaining momentum lately in conservative circles, where anxieties over falling birth rates have converged with fears of rising immigration, and counts Elon Musk, who has nearly a dozen children, and Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban among its proponents. Natalism is often about more than raising birth rates, though that is certainly one of its aims. For many in the room, the ultimate goal is a total social overhaul, a culture in which child rearing is paramount. NatalCon's emphasis on childbirth notwithstanding, there are very few women in the cavernous conference room at the Lion Hotel. The mostly male audience includes people of all ages, many of whom are childless themselves. Some of the women in attendance, however, have come to Austin with their children in tow, a visual representation of the desired outcome of this weekend. As if to emphasize the reason we're all gathered here today, a baby babbles in the background while Dolan delivers his opening remarks. Broadly speaking, the people who have paid as much as $1,000 to attend the conference are members of the New Right, a conglomeration of people in the populist wing of the conservative movement who believe we need seismic changes to the way we live now, and who often see the past as the best model for the future they'd like to build. Their ideology, such as it exists, is far from cohesive, and factions of the New Right are frequently in disagreement. But this weekend, these roughly aligned groups, from the libertarian-adjacent tech types to the Heritage Foundation staffers, along with some who likely have no connection with traditionally conservative or far-right causes at all, have found a unifying cause in natalism. At first glance, this conference might look like something new, a case for having kids that is rooted in a critique of the market-driven forces that shape our lives and the shifts that have made our culture less family-oriented. As Dolan later tells me in an email, declining birth rates are primarily the fault of default middle-class life path offered by our educational system and corporate employers, which Dolan says is in obvious competition with starting a family. These systems, he believes, have created a consumer-driven hedonistic society that requires its members to be slavishly devoted to their office jobs, often at the expense of starting a family. So I'll just ask you, obviously don't feel like you have to answer this, but do you guys have kids? Do you want kids? What's stopping you from having kids? I've heard people say, oh, I don't want to bring kids into this world. This world is so horrible. No, the world is beautiful. You should bring kids into it. And some people say, I can't have kids. It's too expensive. It's true. Kids are expensive. You should still have them. But you should comment on that. I'd be interested to know if you want to. Obviously, it's none of my business. Over the course of the conference, the seemingly novel arguments for having children fade and give way to a different set of concerns. Throughout the day, speakers and participants hint at the other aspects of modern life that worried them about future generations in the US and other parts of the West. Divorce, gender integration, wokeness, declining genetic quality. Yeah, guys, you know, there's a book, for example, Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy. Which isn't really a book on natalism, I just mentioned it because it has that breeding in the title. Many of the speakers and attendees see natalism as a way of reversing these changes. As the speakers chart their roadmaps for raising birth rates, it becomes evident that for the most dedicated of them, the mission is to build an army of like-minded people, starting with their own children, who will reject a whole host of changes wrought by liberal democracy, and who perhaps one day will amount to a population large enough to affect more lasting change. This conference suggests there's a simple way around the problem of majority rule: breeding a new majority, one that looks and sounds just like them. Okay, sorry, hang on. In recent years, various factions of the old and the new right have coalesced around the idea that babies might be the cure for everything that's wrong with society in the United States and other parts of the developed West. It's not a new argument. Natalists made similar claims in the early 20th century when urbanization drove birth rates down and European immigration kept the US population afloat. Then, too, people attributed the drop in fertility rates to endemic selfishness among young people. Throughout it all, some religious conservative cultures have continued to see raising large broods as a divine mandate. White supremacists, meanwhile, have framed their project as a way of ensuring a future for white children, as declared by David Lane, a founding member of the white nationalist group, The Order. More recently, natalist thinking has emerged among tech types interested in funding and using experimental reproductive technologies, and conservatives concerned about falling fertility rates and what they might mean for the future labor force of the United States and elsewhere in the developed world. The conservative think tanks, the Center for Renewing America and the Heritage Foundation, the latter of which was represented at NatalCon, have proposed policies for a potential second Trump administration that would promote having children and raising them in nuclear families, including limiting access to contraceptives, banning no-fault divorce, and ending policies that subsidize single motherhood. Though Dolan opens the conference by talking about the potential economic consequences of a global birth dearth, he and the other NatalCon speakers aren't primarily concerned with the utilitarian arguments for raising birth rates. "I'm not trying to have grandkids so they can fund Medicare," Dolan says. "We are here because we agree that people are beautiful, that life is beautiful, and that it should go on." Dolan, a conservative Mormon and former Booz Allen Hamilton data scientist, resigned from his job in 2021 after a group of self-proclaimed anti-fascist Mormon activists exposed his anonymous Twitter account, which tied him to the far-right Deseret nationalist movement. Having lost his livelihood and security clearance, Dolan started the Exit Group, a fraternity of like-minded men who are preparing for the supposed collapse of American society and who, as of recently, have taken on the decline in birth rates as their pet cause. By the way, I just want to say, I'm not offering any editorial comment on these figures or movements because I've never heard of any of them. Okay, I'm hearing them all here for the first time. In some cases, I can pause and comment if I think something is stated accurately or not, but here I can't because I don't know who any of these people are. This is the first I've read about all of them, including about the conference. On his podcast, Dolan says he was first alerted to the problem of demographic collapse by a member of the Exit Group, which claims to have 171 members. Dolan came up with the idea for NatalCon after watching The End of Men, Tucker Carlson's documentary about collapsing testosterone levels in the West. Here I can say something. This is just in passing, okay, for those of you who happen to be interested in it. I'm not an expert in this area, but I will mention it. So I had someone once upon a time reach out to me because of my work on Dugan to suggest another theorist of civilizational cycles named, what's the guy's name? His book is called Biohistory. His field of research is called biohistory. Somebody, if you look it up, just put the name in the chat, okay? And the biohistory book that I read, it said, in fact, I'm just mentioning this in relationship to testosterone and declining Western civilization, because according to this guy in the whatever I said, that guy's book, he said, when civilizations decline, testosterone levels go up. That civilization correlates with decline of testosterone. Anyway, biohistory. If you're interested in that sort of thing, you can look into it. He looks into what sort of biological markers change in the course of civilizational cycles. And I thought that was interesting that he said testosterone levels go up at a time of civilizational decay and that they go down when you have the civilizing process. Yeah, there's something else on that I recently heard. I think it was RFK Jr. didn't he say something about, well, it was a little bit of a different point, because he was saying that in the United States, youths are hitting puberty sooner than they should. He tied that in with diet, nutrition, and all of that, but I think it matches what in the biohistory books is a biological marker for civilizational decay. Anyway, that's just in passing, okay? I'm no expert on the testosterone question. So if you want, you can watch Tucker Carlson's documentary about collapsing testosterone levels. And when this person, Dolan, saw that documentary, he had the idea for NatalCon. The global drop in sperm concentrations has indeed puzzled scientists for decades and is believed to be one of the factors that has contributed to the global downturn in birth rates. But NatalCon's organizers and attendees seem more interested in combating social institutions like corporate employment and the educational system set up to support it, that in Dolan's words have suppressed fertility by being hostile to life. Sorry, hold on a second. I don't like that I told you about a book, but I didn't tell you the author, so I should tell you the author, right? I think it's Jim Penman. Is that it? Yeah, Dr. Jim Penman, Biohistory, Decline and Fall of the West. Okay, there you go. Biohistory, Jim Penman. That's the guy I was talking about who links rise and decline of testosterone levels, among other biomarkers, to civilizational cycles. Yeah, I needed to tell you that because otherwise I wouldn't have a clean conscience. Can't mention books and not mention the author. Okay, where were we here, guys? I'm sorry, I lost my spot. Let's go back. We had Dolan, Booz Allen. I think we're here, right? Yeah. Okay. Back to the article. Most of the first day of the conference is spent defining the problem. In a nutshell, sperm counts are historically low. Our bodies are full of microplastics. I gotta say something else about sperm count. So I've been teaching lately one of my favorite books. I would say that it is arguably Plato's greatest dialogue, not studied nearly often enough. I'm doing a course on it. I spoke about it in El Salvador. I tell everybody about it now because I think that the right people will read it when they hear about it. That's Plato's Laws. And there's a section of Plato's Laws that's kind of funny. It's also interesting and insightful. It's where there's a question about how the legislator should deal with strong erotic desires, which are in a political community often a source of violent conflict, right? Somebody looked at your woman the wrong way, you go and bash his head in her. Somebody slept with your wife, you go and cut his throat. You know, like passion, erotic passion, is directly related to the problem of law and order in a political community. So in Plato's book, The Laws, the main characters there, they do some legislation and they give some persuasive speeches concerning the regulation of our erotic desire. But then there's a passage in English that reads as follows. He says, okay, you know, we may want to regulate people's erotic desires, but if some young man full of sperm is listening to us, he's going to laugh at us and he's just going to go ahead and do whatever he wants to do anyway. So, quote unquote, young men full of sperm are a problem from the point of view of the totalitarian legislation of erotic desire. So you could see the flip side of that. If you can emasculate men, reduce their erotic energy, dial down their fullness of sperm, as it says in Plato's Laws, then maybe it will be easier to regulate them. It'll be easier to regulate their erotic affairs, which from the point of view of the control of the political community is important to do. Anyway, I think it's funny. You're reading Plato and you're like, if some young man full of sperm were listening to us, he'd laugh in our faces and tell us that what we're trying to do is ridiculous and impossible. Okay, so back to the article. Most of the first day of the conference is spent defining the problem. In a nutshell, sperm counts are historically low. Our bodies are full of microplastics. Okay, good thing I'm not drinking out of a plastic bottle today. I have a cup of water, a cup of coffee, and a Red Bull. So that's good. Whew. Our body, oh, I already have kids, so. Public schools are indoctrinating children against the good Christian values with which they were raised. Dating apps have gamified romance, tricking lonely singles into believing that a better prospect is always around the corner. Women have been convinced that they can have it all, kids and a career and endless vacations and so much more, only to end up unhappy, infertile, and alone. The speakers who lay out this bleak state of affairs are a motley crew of the extremely online right, many of whom go by their X, website formerly called Twitter, handles rather than their names. Via Zoom, anonymous Twitter user Raw Egg Nationalist warns us about endoctrin disruptors in everything from perfume to bottled water. Ben Braddock, an editor at the conservative magazine I Am 1776, claims that antidepressants and birth control pills have permanent detrimental effects on women's fertility. Together, the speakers paint a dire picture of a society that has lost its way, abandoning fundamental biological truths and dooming itself to annihilation in the process. Pause, because I just want to put in a good word for I Am 1776. I have published there several times, and they do good work. The solution, of course, is to have more babies. Peachy Keenan, a pseudonymous writer affiliated with the conservative Claremont Institute, okay, another place that you may want to check out, urges attendees to seize the means of reproduction, as in to outbreed liberals who are already hobbling their movement by choosing to have just a couple children or not at all. I'll just share with you the funny image that came to my mind. If you've ever seen The Great Dictator, Charlie Chaplin movie, I guess spoiler alert, okay, if you haven't seen it, you don't want to hear this, but there's a scene where there's, what is it, like Charlie Chaplin and Mussolini or something like that. They're in barber chairs and he jacks up his chair and then he goes higher and then he goes higher, he goes higher. It's like, who's, you know. Anyways, just think about that with kids, right? So we're going to out baby you, we're going to out baby you, we're going to out baby you. Watch The Great Dictator if you want. If not, whatever. So here lies the project spelled out in detail. The people who disagree have bloodlines that are slowly going to die out. To speed up that process, thank you for the super chat. I appreciate that. Let me just pause to read it. Hi, I'm working on a Nietzsche paper that deals heavily with controversial topics. Do you have any advice? Should I message you somewhere? Hey, Johan, you can email me for sure, millermanmichael@gmail.com. Reach out to me through the channel or through the school. We could talk about it. So here lies the project spelled out in detail. The people who disagree have bloodlines that are slowly going to die out. To speed up that process, to have this particular strain of conservative natalist ideology become dominant quickly in the United States, everyone in this room has to have more kids and fast. You know, I gotta say something about that too. Well, I'll be brief about it. It's kind of banal, but it's still interesting, which is that there's no guarantee that your children will think the way you do, even if you raise them to think the way you do. You know that, right? Because there's a problem, for example, of, in a hereditary monarchy, right? You have certain qualities. Does that mean that your kin, your progeny, are going to have those same qualities? Yeah, I'm tall. My firstborn son is tall, thank God. I'm relatively intelligent. He's even more intelligent than I am. We're all on track to be. So sometimes these things pan out. Same with my other kids. They're all great. That's not the point. The point is, just having children does not mean that they're going to see the world the way you do. I know some conservative parents who have liberal kids and presumably vice versa. So that only solves half the problem, I guess. It's only when speakers get to who should have more babies and how they should raise them that their deeper concerns and the larger anxieties behind this conference become clear. The goal, as put by Indian Bronson, the pseudonymous co-founder of the elite matchmaking service Keeper, is more, better people. So what are we looking at here? This is a picture. People who are at the conference. Okay, but the speakers lack consensus on the meaning of the word better, as they do on the subject of using technology to encourage the best and brightest among us to breed. Guys, this is another reason why I think it's so important to have familiarity with classical political philosophy, because all of these questions are addressed very intelligently by Plato and Aristotle. It doesn't mean that you can just map Plato and Aristotle directly onto today's problems for immediate cookie cutter solutions, but start there. Keenan, who has previously celebrated her sense that it is now acceptable to say white genocide is real, says better means conservative. Pat Fagan, the director of the Marriage and Religious Institute at the Catholic University of America, says good children are the product of stable two-parent Christian households, away from the corrupting influences of public school and sex ed. Christian couples, he adds, have the best, most orgasmic sex, citing no research or surveys to support this. To protect these households, we must abolish no-fault divorce, declares Britt Benjamin, a lawyer with waist-length curly red hair. Until relatively recently, Benjamin was married to Patry Friedman, grandson of economist Milton Friedman, the founder of the Seasteading Institute, a Peter Thiel-backed effort to build new libertarian enclaves at sea. And to ensure that these children grow up to be adults who understand their proper place in both the family and the larger social order, we need to oust women from the workforce and reinstitute male-only spaces where women are disadvantaged as a result. Shampoo magnate and aspiring warlord Charles Haywood says, prompting cheers from men in the audience. Haywood's final words to the audience elicit raucous applause. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its progeny are probably the single most destructive set of laws in American history, and all should be wiped forever, he says before getting off stage. A few women told me afterward, the author adds parenthetically, they and others disagreed with Haywood. Notably, most of the speakers do not make a case for more immigration to counter the trend of declining birth rates. Immigrants can't solve our population problem, Dolan says, because they'll eventually realize they were brought here to pay into Social Security for old white people. On X, Dolan has used the word replacement to refer to immigration. Some at the conference are interested in the genetics of the children they believe everyone should be having. Evolutionary biologist Dana Fleischman and writer Jonathan Anomaly argue that genetics are destiny. I shouldn't say good quality children, Fleischman says after speaking at length about how people with mental illness are statistically likely to marry other mentally ill people and pass those genes along to their children, suggesting some children are indeed biologically better than others. Razib Khan, a geneticist and science blogger who in 2015 was hired and quickly fired by the New York Times opinion section after Gawker reported on his ties to racist far-right publications, illustrates the problem of current demographic trends in the West compared to other regions by pointing to Ethiopia, which had nearly as many births in 2020 as the entire European continent. This is the future we're already in, says Khan, who is Bangladeshi American. Many of you have young children. They will live to see this world. Over and over throughout the conference, anxieties over the drop in birth rates, the issue that brought the speakers and audience together, gave way to fears that certain populations were outbreeding their betters. Though few speakers explicitly mentioned race, the conference provided an opportunity for those with genuine concerns about population decline to join forces with and perhaps be influenced by those who espouse racist or regressive views, according to the author. During the second day of the conference, a closed-door phone-off event dedicated to brainstorming ways to reverse the population crisis, VIP ticket holders mingled with Jared Taylor, the publisher of the white supremacist magazine American Renaissance, according to multiple people in attendance who wanted to remain anonymous because having their name linked to the conference would jeopardize their work. The following day, I, the author of this piece at Politico on the Natalism conference, the following day, I talked with Malcolm and Simone Collins, the husband and wife founder of pronatalist.org, who went viral in 2023 after the Telegraph dubbed them the elite couple breeding to save mankind. They are entrepreneurs and investors and previously served as co-CEOs of a travel agency company. Simone is also currently running for a seat in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. The Collinses tell me they want to promote a plurality of cultures and protect everyone's right to be weird. Malcolm says they want to make their movement a big tent and initially were worried about what kinds of people the conference would attract. Are they going to be like no transgender people reading kids' book? Are they going to be kids' books? Are they going to be racist? Not jobs. It's a real concern, he says. The Collinses, parents of 4 children, present themselves as rationalists, techies trying to solve the looming depopulation crisis by any means necessary. Simone was pregnant with the 4th child during the conference. That baby, Industry Americus Collins, was born in April. With their 3rd and 4th children, the Collinses used a pre-implementation genetic test that allowed them to select an embryo with optimum genetic makeup. And here I guess I'll quickly ask those of you who feel like commenting on this issue, what are the limits, in your opinion, of pre-implementation genetic tests? Should they just be to catch and screen for diseases, or should they be to select the characteristics of an Uberman? And by the way, what would the characteristics of an Uberman or Uberwoman be? Because as I was recently discussing with a student of mine in private tutoring, this was during the Olympics, think about athletic excellence. Think about athletic excellence in the Olympic Games, but there are so many different body types, so many different adaptations of the body to the sport. Are you going to breed the perfect archer, the perfect trampolinist, the perfect diver, the perfect wrestler, perfect ping pong player? But they too are far more interested in the cultural implications of declining fertility rates than their fascination with reproductive technologies might lead you to believe. The couple, the Collinses, the couple is committed to fighting the urban monoculture that they claim has tricked a generation of young Americans into spending their most fertile years chasing professional achievements and personal fulfillment at the expense of building a family. The monoculture is not an evil thing, Malcolm says over Penang curry and pineapple fried rice at a Thai restaurant the day after the conference's VIP event. But he continues, it's built on false promises. It promises people if you join us, you can do whatever makes you happy as long as you don't interfere with other people's quality of life. And you can be affirmed for whoever you want to be. In reality, though, they become casualties of an elitist scam. The urban monoculture, Malcolm explains, breeds childlessness and therefore must poach other people's children to survive. It lures them out of small towns and into large cities, encourages them to eschew their religious upbringings in favor of hedonistic secularism, and then leaves them to die alone. Malcolm compares the urban monoculture to the boarding schools the Canadian government forced Native children into, in which Indigenous children were forcibly assimilated into white culture. The US government had similar boarding schools. It doesn't matter if you're trying to convert them to a culture that's closer to mine, what you're doing is wrong, he says. When I tell him the boarding schools were a state program, not a voluntary form of acculturation, Malcolm becomes animated. This is a state project. What's going on in the public schools is a state project. The mechanisms that the urban monoculture uses to deconvert people are primarily a state-funded educational system, he says. In a subsequent email, he describes the urban monoculture as one of the descendants of European imperialism. The most important and effective way to fight the monoculture, Malcolm later tells me via email, is building school systems not dedicated to cultural genocide. Guys, I'll pause for a minute and remind you that this relates to themes we discuss on this channel all the time, including two articles that were covered yesterday. The relationship between the regime type, its form of education, and the kind of citizen that it produces as a function of its education. The goal, though, the Collinses tell me, is not to convert the childless or even to counteract the phenomena that contribute to the unplanned childlessness that has become endemic among millennials. It is to encourage people with a lot of children to have even more. I'm sweating here because I've got 3 children. I'm thinking maybe I should have 10. It's to encourage people with a lot of children to have even more. Some people matter less than other people in getting fertility rates up, Malcolm says. Helping somebody who has 4 kids but wants 8 is more important than helping someone who has none but wants 1. Sorry, just stretching out a bit. Ultimately, this is what unites the Collinses with the more trad wings of the natalist movement, from the nativists to the Christian nationalists, pushing back on social and cultural changes they see as imposed on them by outside forces. To do that, these conference attendees have coalesced around a solution that won't require them to persuade skeptics to join their cause. If everything goes as planned, the competition will go extinct on their own, right? So you have 0, stay with 0. You have 4, good, have 4 more. All the natalists have to do is have enough kids so that in a generation or 2, they'll be the ones who inherit the earth. Okay, so that was interesting. Have you guys heard about that before? This conference, the Natal, what was it called again? Natal conference, yeah. The Natal conference in Austin. Okay, the first Natal conference in Austin, December 2023. Maybe there will be another one in December 2024. I have heard about Viktor Orban's policies. I think if you have 4 children, then you're exempt from income tax for the rest of your life or something like that. Although I believe I've also heard that it hasn't been particularly effective in having an increase in birth rates. Okay, so this question. Number 1, are birth rates too low? What's an effective policy in increasing birth rates? And the different vectors on which you can try to change that outcome: financial, educational, cultural. Good topic. Good topic. I think someone recommended this yesterday. Well, okay, guys, it's been a good stream so far. I hope you're enjoying it. The first article, just to remind you, was, you see that on screen? Overman on Nietzsche and Our Crisis of Masculinity, published at thepointmag.com. And then we just now read from Politico. I guess I didn't tell you the name of the author. Who is the author? Do we even have the author's name here? So it's, anyways, published at Politico, the far right's campaign to explode the population. Maybe the author's at the bottom. Just like to give credit where it's due. I didn't write it, so I don't see any attribution. Well, anyway, it's at Politico. There you go. If you enjoyed that, you can look up some of those people and make your own decision about who they are and what they stand for, what you agree and disagree with. Let's go over to the chat for a minute. So I see some things are going on. So somebody, NG Benji, would select for tall, handsome, smart, athletic, healthy. There's this issue of bringing back eugenics. I think I read an article on this channel not long ago called The Return of Eugenics. If I didn't read it, you can look it up and see for yourselves. I think that was a pretty good article. Maybe I just read it on my own. Some other comments here. I prefer my kids having Catholic values and courage over intelligence. So I don't know, maybe you can select for intelligence genetically. Can you select for Catholic values and courage genetically? These are questions, I guess, as access to the genetic pre-screening and all of that becomes interesting. So I might enjoy a conversation with the Collins on their podcast. Maybe. I'm open to invitations, I guess. If people want to reach out, then we had that super chat. Thanks again for that. Okay, well, anyway, those were those articles. Let me just think here for a minute whether I have it in me to do another one, because I did have some other ones lined up. I mean, let me just show you what they were, I guess. This is from Modern Age, Reflections on Mirrors for Princes. And one of the reasons I wanted to look at that is because there's an author I quite like, Balthazar Gracian, who wrote A Pocket Mirror for Heroes. He writes in the Mirror for Princes genre, and it could be interesting to see, but I think all the same, I'll keep that for another day. And then I'm just going to show this to you because you may want to read it on your own, even if I'm not reading it on the channel. josephheath.substack.com. I think this was at Arts and Letters Daily too, aldaily.com. John Rawls and the Death of Western Marxism. But honestly, I think I'm running out of energy here. So, okay, guys, thank you for spending your time with me this morning. I hope you enjoyed that. Like, share, subscribe, comment. Go to millermanschool.com if you're interested in my courses. All the links are in the description. Check out the authors and the publications that we covered today. And take care. Be well. Goodbye.